Jake stepped outside and froze. His front gate was gone, smashed into splinters on the curb. Someone had crossed the line, invading his home without a word. Fear and fury gripped him as he realized this was no accident. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Jake stood frozen, staring down at the wreckage of what had been his sanctuary, his pride. The wooden gate was more than just a physical barrier. It was the embodiment of countless evenings spent sanding, staining, and carefully assembling each plank with patience and care. He remembered how, during the long summer days, he had crafted that gate with his own hands, not just to secure his property, but to add a personal touch that reflected his values and tastes, however modest. Now, that intimate labor was reduced to a pile of refuse, discarded like trash on his own lawn. What stung most wasn't just the destruction, it was the utter disregard for protocol, respect, and basic decency. The HOA's governing documents, while stringent, made no mention of unilateral demolitions or confiscations without notice or dialogue. Yet here was Richard Collins, wielding his self-appointed authority like a tyrant, indifferent to the fundamental principle that a person's home should be their last refuge, not a battlefield. Richard's decision was not just an enforcement of rules, it was a deliberate act of intimidation, an assertion of control meant to send a message to anyone who dared deviate from his vision of conformity. Jake's mind raced as he recalled his attempts to engage with the HOA board in the past, attempts to propose reasonable compromises, to voice concerns about overreach, to ask for transparency. Each time, Richard had stonewalled him, dismissing his input with a condescending smile and cutting remarks veiled as neighborhood harmony. The gate had become a symbol of resistance, a small but potent beacon of individualism in a sea of cookie-cutter houses and manicured lawns. And now that symbol was gone, replaced by raw aggression and petty vindictiveness. This wasn't a simple dispute over aesthetics. It was a war of wills masked behind bureaucratic jargon and legalese. Richard's rationale, some vague, nebulous aesthetic standard no one had ever heard of, was a smokescreen for something darker, personal grudges and unchecked power. The very essence of community, Jake realized, was at stake. Should a handful of people dictate every visible detail of everyone else's homes? Where was the line between order and oppression? He looked around, noticing how neighbors, who usually waved hello, avoided his gaze now, perhaps too wary of crossing Richard, or simply unwilling to get involved. That isolation only fueled his resolve. Jake understood that this was not just about him or a gate. It was about setting a precedent. If he allowed this injustice to stand, the invisible chains of conformity would tighten, suffocating the spirit of the entire neighborhood. His anger morphed into determination. He would not be a passive victim of this authoritarian overreach. But before he could fight, he needed ammunition, knowledge of the rules, of the HOA's governance, and any leverage he could find. He began mentally cataloging every conversation, every email, every meeting where Richard had overstepped or contradicted the bylaws. There had to be inconsistencies, loopholes, or outright violations that could turn the tide. The destruction of the gate was an assault on his property, yes, but more profoundly, it was an assault on fairness and dignity. In that moment, Jake understood the deeper fight ahead, one not merely about a gate, but about reclaiming his right to live with autonomy and respect in his own home. His fight would ripple beyond Maplewood's manicured streets. It was a battle for the principles that underpin community and liberty. He clenched his fists, a fire ignited within him that no bureaucratic hammer could quench. This was no longer a personal loss. It was a call to action against the creeping tyranny of unchecked power. Jake's mind sharpened into focus, ready to navigate the maze of rules, politics, and social undercurrents that awaited him. The gate was gone, but the fight for his home and for justice had just begun. The days stretched long and heavy, each one carving deeper into Jake's resolve as the weight of confrontation settled like a shadow over his once tranquil life. The very air around his home felt thick with unspoken tension. The neighborhood's quiet streets no longer offered comfort, but whispered judgments and cold shoulders. Attempts at dialogue with Richard and the HOA board proved futile, their responses slick with thinly veiled hostility and sanctimonious lectures about community harmony. Yet, beneath the polished veneer of civility lurked an unmistakable undercurrent of vindictiveness. Richard, secure in his position, seemed intent not just on enforcing rules, but on breaking Jake's spirit. Even familiar faces, neighbors who once exchanged casual greetings, now glanced away or offered terse nods, their allegiance swallowed by fear of Richard's influence. The insidious nature of that power left Jake isolated in his own home, turning a place of refuge into a stage for quiet cruelty. The destruction of his gate reverberated beyond physical loss. It was a violation, an intrusion into his personal dignity that left him raw and exposed. Every passerby's eye felt like a silent accusation, a reminder that he had been cast out from the invisible social order Richard controlled. Despite the relentless pressure, Jake's pain forged a steely determination rather than surrender. The humiliation gnawed at him, but it also ignited a flicker of defiance, a refusal to let his story end in resignation. The gate was more than timber. It was the boundary between submission and self-respect. Without it, he felt stripped of the right to define his own space, yet that very loss propelled him to seek justice not through compliance, but confrontation. It was in this darkest hour that Emily Brooks entered the picture, a local lawyer whose reputation for standing against institutional overreach preceded her. Emily's office smelled faintly of old books and freshly brewed coffee, a quiet sanctuary from the storm. From their first meeting, her voice carried a rare mix of empathy and steely resolve. She saw beyond the legalese and recognized the human toll beneath the conflict. Emily understood the importance of this fight, not just as a legal battle, but as a stand against the corrosive abuse of authority that too often goes unchecked in small communities. Together, they scrutinized the HOA's bylaws and meeting minutes, hunting for cracks in Richard's armor. The language was dense and labyrinthine, peppered with ambiguous clauses and vague standards, convenient tools for those wishing to wield power arbitrarily. Yet, Emily's keen eye uncovered inconsistencies and procedural missteps that cast serious doubt on the legitimacy of the gate's removal. More than that, she championed the narrative of personal violation, framing Jake's plight as a matter of fundamental fairness and respect for individual rights within a community framework. Filing the lawsuit was a pivotal moment, a transformation from passive victim to active challenger. The complaint demanded not only the restoration of the gate, but also compensation for damages, physical, emotional, and social. This legal action reverberated through Maplewood, sparking heated conversations at block parties, whispered debates at the local coffee shop, and divided opinions that fractured the once unified facade of the neighborhood. Supporters saw Jake as a David standing up to a Goliath cloaked in HOA authority. Detractors branded him a troublemaker, disrupting the peace. For Jake, the lawsuit was more than a legal strategy. It was a reclamation of agency, a beacon of hope amidst the encroaching darkness. The process, grueling and uncertain, infused his days with renewed purpose. He pored over documents, prepared statements, and braced himself for hearings that felt like battles fought on a psychological battlefield. Every small victory discovery of a procedural error, a sympathetic witness, a well-argued motion rekindled the fire within him. What began as a personal grievance blossomed into a broader struggle for justice, one that transcended the boundaries of his own yard. Jake found himself at the nexus of a community conversation about power, fairness, and respect. His fight illuminated the dangerous consequences when unchecked authority replaces dialogue and empathy. Though the road ahead was steep and fraught with challenges, the solidarity forged with Emily and the few neighbors willing to stand by him offered a fragile yet vital promise that even in the face of overwhelming odds, resilience could cultivate hope. The battle had transformed pain into purpose, turning a shattered gate into a symbol not of defeat, but of resistance. Jake's fight was no longer about mere wood and nails. It was about reclaiming dignity, demanding accountability, and inspiring a community to reckon with the true meaning of harmony. The courtroom was a stark chamber of solemnity and tension, where the weight of months of conflict finally coalesced into a decisive moment. The air was thick with anticipation, the echoes of whispered conversations, and the shuffle of papers mingling with the palpable energy of justice in motion. Jake sat, rigid, every nerve taut with a mixture of apprehension and hope, while Richard Collins, the HOA president, projected an aura of forced confidence, his defenses rehearsed but brittle beneath scrutiny. Richard's arguments were thin veils stretched over a festering vendetta. He invoked vague community standards and the supposed necessity of maintaining uniformity, but the judge's piercing questions unraveled the facade. It became clear that Richard's motivations extended far beyond mere rule enforcement. His hostility toward Jake, fueled by personal grievance and a desire to assert dominance, had warped the purpose of the HOA's authority into a tool of oppression. The court's proceedings exposed not just a technical dispute about a wooden gate, but a struggle between arbitrary power and individual rights. Throughout the hearing, Emily Brooks's legal prowess shone with unwavering clarity. She dissected the HOA's procedures, highlighting procedural violations and inconsistencies that undermined Richard's position. Her arguments transcended the mere facts of the case, invoking fundamental principles of fairness and justice that resonated deeply with the court. She painted Jake not merely as a homeowner wronged, but as a symbol of resistance against the misuse of power cloaked in bureaucratic language. When the verdict was delivered, unambiguous and decisive, it resonated like a thunderclap through the courtroom. The judge ordered Richard to not only rebuild the gate exactly as Jake had constructed it, but also to bear the financial burden of the damage and legal fees. It was a legal and moral vindication, a public acknowledgement that abuse of power would not be tolerated, even within the microcosm of a suburban neighborhood. As the ruling rippled outward, Jake felt an overwhelming surge of triumph mixed with profound relief. Standing before the newly rebuilt gate weeks later, the polished wood gleaming under the sun, he was acutely aware of the symbolic weight it bore. This gate, once reduced to splinters and nails, now stood as a testament not merely to craftsmanship, but to resilience, justice, and the restoration of dignity. The physical boundary it represented was inseparable from the invisible boundary Jake had fought to reclaim, his right to define his home and his life on his terms. The victory transcended personal satisfaction. It sent ripples far beyond Maplewood's tree-lined streets, inspiring conversations about accountability, community, and the courage to confront oppression. Jake's story became a beacon for others facing similar struggles, a narrative repeated in hushed tones and shared in online forums, proof that even against entrenched systems, individuals could reclaim power and dignity. In neighborhoods across the country, his stand ignited hope in those who felt powerless, urging them to speak out and resist injustice, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. Yet, amid the applause and recognition, Jake remained grounded. His battle had been hard won, a reminder that justice is rarely delivered without struggle and sacrifice. The scars left by Richard's campaign of intimidation were not erased overnight, but the triumph had forged something stronger, a renewed belief in the human spirit's capacity to endure and rebuild. Richard's defeat was personal, an unraveling of his carefully constructed dominion, but Jake's victory belonged to something larger, an affirmation that dignity, fairness, and courage could prevail even in the face of cruelty disguised as order. The gate stood not only as a boundary to Jake's yard, but as a monument to the principle that no individual should be crushed under the weight of arbitrary authority. In the quiet moments after the crowd dispersed and the neighborhood returned to its rhythms, Jake found himself reflecting on the journey from violation to vindication. The path had been arduous, marked by pain and isolation, yet it culminated in a justice rebuilt not just in wood and nails, but in the hearts of those who witnessed his stand. The triumph was not the end, but a powerful beginning. A call to vigilance and courage, a reminder that when wrongs are challenged with integrity and resolve, the human spirit can rise, rebuild, and shine brighter than ever before.